Hey, it's Bob Pulver. Welcome back to Elevate Your AIQ. Today, I am joined by Siri Chilazi, Senior Researcher for the Women and Public Policy Program at the Harvard Kennedy School and co-author of the new book, Make Work Fair, Data-Driven Design for Real Results. Siri is a leading voice in evidence-based approaches to fairness at work, and we dive deep into how organizations can move from good intentions to measurable impact. We talk about applying scientific rigor to DEI efforts, what it means to build human-centric and responsible AI systems, and how we can design the future of work with fairness, flexibility, and accountability in mind. Thanks for listening. As always, I think you get a lot out of this conversation. Let's go chat with Siri. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Elevate Your AIQ. I am your host, Bob Pulver. With me today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Siri Chilazi. How are you today, Siri?
I'm so great, Bob. Thank you for having me. It's thrilled to be here.
We met, just to give people a little bit of background, we met at a New York City HR analytics event where you were talking to the community about your recent book, which I know we're going to dive in and talk about. Very relevant, very timely, and it's something that I've grown increasingly passionate in terms of human-centric, solutions, making sure that with all this AI buzz going around, that we still focus on what makes us human, and we're still able to thrive through all of this. So anyway, with that, I'll let you give yourself a proper introduction about some of your work, the book, teaching, etc.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. I am a researcher at Harvard Kennedy School at the Women in Public Policy Program, studying fairness at work. My focus traditionally has been on gender, so looking at how we can advance the equality between women and men in the workplace through a solution-centered approach. What I mean by that is there's been a lot of research done historically that documents how discrimination or conscious bias or even unconscious bias shows up in things like recruitment and performance evaluations and promotions and various other workplace opportunities. So we kind of understand very well what the problems are. Historically, there's been much less effort spent on, well, how can we solve them? If we know that, for example, mentioning that you're a parent on your resume, such as because you're maybe a member of the PTA, that results in a lower salary offer if you're actually offered a job compared to a similar applicant who doesn't indicate that they're a parent. If that's the problem that we're trying to solve, how might we change the formatting of resumes or the way we evaluate them or the hiring process to actually level the playing field and make sure that people are not unfairly advantaged or disadvantaged? And so I collaborate with colleagues around the world to run large-scale experiments in real companies, real organizations, to test out some of these solutions. And oftentimes they work as intended, and sometimes they don't, which is why the testing and experimentation piece is so critical.
Yeah, and it'd be nice to catch some of these things before they make the headlines for the wrong reasons, right? And do thorough evaluations, make sure we're using all the data, the trusted data that we have access to, and make sure that, before these start to flow downstream through the talent lifecycle into decision-making processes, that we've actually, vetted these appropriately.
Exactly. So our new book that you mentioned, Make Work Fair, Data-Driven Design for Real Results, I co-authored it with my colleague from Harvard Kennedy School, Iris Bennett. And we like to make this analogy to clinical trials, right? The processes whereby we test medicines. Most of us are not chemists, so we don't understand why drugs work to cure our ailments. But we have confidence in their safety and efficacy because we know that there's an entity called the FDA in the US, and in Europe, it's called the European Medicines Agency, that oversees a rigorous process of testing these drugs through clinical trials before they ever make it onto the market. And so by the time they hit the shelves and our doctors prescribe us these medicines, we can be assured, for the most part, they actually are safe and they're by and large going to do what they purport to do. And by the way, this wasn't always the case, because one of the reasons why we have the system in place that we have today is back in the 1950s and 60s, some drugs made it onto the market that had catastrophic consequences, massive birth defects for babies, people dying right and left. And so from that, we kind of collectively decided, wait a second, there has to be a way of testing and establishing the effects of these very, very powerful medicines before we unleash them into the world. And there's actually a sort of perfect, I would say, correspondence between that and where we find ourselves today with technology, because we're creating increasingly powerful technologies, some of which we understand and some of which work in ways that we as humans might not even fully understand. We might not fully track how these systems and artificial intelligence engines are making the decisions that they're making. So it's even more critical to apply that same kind of testing protocol before this powerful technology is widely available in the world.
I love the healthcare and sort of medical, analogy, because I think it shows the importance of, like you said, this thorough, testing all different, populations, different, genetic composition, different,
Yeah.
getting the diverse use cases to make sure that we're not adversely impacting someone that maybe isn't studied as much. And I think there's a lot of analogies to, minority, populations and previously disadvantaged,
Yeah.
populations. So
But the other thing that's happening right now in medicine, again, with better technology and just advancing science and understanding of humans, is this idea of personalized medicine, which means sometimes we might test a drug on a cross section of the population, representative cross section even, and it doesn't look like on average the drug works. But when you analyze the data by subgroups, you split people by gender and race or age or the stage of disease that they have, whatever the condition is, or any other kind of subgroup, you might pick up that the drug is actually fabulously effective for those subgroups. And you would have missed that if you were only looking at the average aggregate data for everybody. So I think that's also a lesson for us in, it's so important to use data. It's so important to be driven by the evidence, but that doesn't just exist at one level, right? There's always deeper and deeper levels of data analysis that you could do that could potentially challenge your initial understandings.
so is part of the challenge that you're seeing in this space, whether we're talking about, hiring fairness or pay equity, et cetera, that we've got I guess, a data and analytics maturity issue,
Hmm.
right? That not enough people know how either have the quality, data to look at and examine, or is it that we're trying to move? Too many of us are trying to move fast and break things. It's probably a combination of factors,
I
I'm
think
guessing.
it's yes and, right? So clearly we are trying to move really fast and break things, especially the wonderful people who are creating these technologies. To your point, a lot of the clients or consumers of the technology, whether that's individuals or whether that's HR leaders in organizations who purchase, for example, hiring software, they don't themselves have the knowledge and the skills to evaluate the software or AI or whatever technological tool it is that they're planning on investing in. They might not have the tools, but oftentimes they also don't have the access, right? So companies keep these proprietary solutions in a black box and say, trust us, it works. But then if as a potential client, you're trying to verify that, you can't. You can't peek inside that black box. And then that also, speaks to the lack of regulation. The FDA, one of the reasons why the medicine verification process works is because there is this government, and in our case, it's a government entity, the FDA, that has the power to force pharma companies to release their data and run trials in a specific way. And currently, we don't have anything similar for technology. So there's no one to compel companies to open the black box, or not even an independent entity that could work with technology creators on a confidential basis to do third-party validation or verification that clients could then trust because it received this credible stamp of approval that even though I didn't, test this technology myself or couldn't validate it, I know that someone else that I trust did validate it. So I
Yeah,
think you said it well, that it's a maturity issue, regulatory landscape maturity, industry maturity, and even technology maturity. But it's also an opportunity to do it better.
absolutely. One of the things that I'm working on is, so I do spend a lot of time in the responsible AI space, but I'm also part of some working groups that focus on human-centric AI. And so the way I separate those two, they are overlapping, right? If you were to put them together in a in a Venn diagram, there's a lot of principles that apply to both. But I guess I think of the responsible AI piece, a lot of it geared towards what you're describing is there an independent body or an oversight body that can actually, validate, certify these solutions, just like we've gone through with, data privacy regulations and cybersecurity, regulations and things like that. But in the absence of that, at least at a federal level here in the U.S., where the states and municipalities have basically taken on that sort of burden, even if there was a federal policy, they probably still would have said, "I'm going to do something that's appropriate for my citizens in my state." But the human-centric lens kind of plays into more of the just general, "Can't we do better than this? Shouldn't we be better at this?" in terms of instilling, fairness and ethics and, morals to how we're evaluating data, how we're thoroughly, sort of testing these things, and can we hold each other accountable? Can the buying community, being in this case like a talent acquisition or talent management teams, workforce analytics teams, can they sort of band together and say we are going to collectively hold the solution providers, accountable, and here's the mechanism that we're going to do that? Because, imagine if we didn't have an FTA, right? You'd still have all these, patients and potential patients screaming to say, we got to come up with something, because I'm not just going to go grab stuff off the shelf with no warning labels, no, these are the known side effects, things like that. So on some level, I feel like in this case, there's an effort underway to create more educated, buyers, to say these are the solutions that I can trust, and there's got to be some mechanisms to be sort of a representation as best we can that knowledgeable people have given this the stamp of approval, if you will.
Yeah. And that makes me think of a parallel that's going to seem far fetched at first, but bear with me because it actually is quite relevant.
Sure.
And that's efforts in the UK over the last 15 years to increase the representation of women on corporate boards. Now, this is, of course, a complex ecosystem because you have these large companies, you have their existing boards, you have headhunters that play a critical role in identifying future board candidates and then placing them actually onto the boards. And so recognizing that it's a complex ecosystem, back in 2011, the UK government took a leading role to initiate kind of a program of activity to say, we want to fix this problem once and for all. At the time, this is back in 2011, only 12.5% of all board members in the FTSE 100, the 100 largest companies in the UK, were women. And by the way, today, that number is nearly 44%. So these efforts have been incredibly successful. But going back to your vision about this kind of accountability in this community, this is exactly what the government did, is they said, we're not going to push a mandate on you. We're going to use our convening power to bring together the chairs of the companies, the current boards, as I mentioned, the headhunters of the executive search firms. They brought in academics to help do more research on the issue, to provide the data. They brought in representatives from the media to help hold people accountable, right? The media started publishing stories about which companies are doing the best at having the most women on their boards, which had none at all. Public naming and shaming, carrot and stick, definitely works. They also brought together what is called a 30% Club, which is a grassroots advocacy organization. So they kind of pulled together all these stakeholders from different part of the ecosystem that could use different kinds of influence and do different things to row the boat in the same direction or push the ball down the field. And as the results demonstrate, it's been very effective. So I think something like that could absolutely come together when it comes to technology, in thinking about all the different stakeholder groups, users, clients, creators, regulators, everybody, and coming up with this sort of collective effort to both make sure that this technology actually gets in the hands of people who can use it, right? So that it might be even more widespread than it is today, but in a responsible and ethical way, such that the technology does what it purports to do, and good things rather than bad things.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think if we can increase the transparency of some of those efforts, I think the better off we'll be, because people will say, well, here's
Hi, I'm Stephen Rothberg.
And I'm Jeanette Leeds.
And together, we're the co-hosts of the High Volume Hiring Podcast.
Are you involved in hiring dozens or even hundreds of employees a year? If so, you know that the typical sourcing tools, tactics, and strategies, they just don't scale.
Yeah, our bi-weekly podcast features news, tips, case studies, and interviews with the world's leading experts about the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to high volume hiring.
Make sure to subscribe today.
Here's my target, right? I see, this particular vendor is not only going through, for example, an independent audit, but they're publishing, the results of that. They're explaining, how their solution works. They're showing, the evidence as much as they can within constraints around, intellectual property and things like
Yep.
that. And then, as you're evaluating vendors, I mean, that's at least for a time, that's going to be, I think, a huge selling point, right? It's like a added, sort of trust factor to say, well, this one's a sort of not necessarily a black box, but I don't know enough. Maybe
Yep.
they can't answer certain questions that I feel are important for them to be able to answer to mitigate my own, risk by deploying this solution, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's just something that as you have more intelligent, I don't want to say intelligent, as you have more educated, buyers, more discerning buyers, and they think about those kinds of things, it's not just going to come down to, which one's cheaper, which one can I deploy the fastest. It's some of these, sort of ethical,
Yeah.
questions and risk-based questions, frankly, that I think are going to separate the winners from the laggards, I guess.
And I think that's where buyers and consumers have more power than they realize. Because if they change the criteria whereby they select, let's say a hiring software or technological solution, very quickly, that starts to influence how the producers of those solutions create them. Because if clients say, hey, I'm concerned about X, right? I'm concerned about, does this create disparate impact between groups? How have you tested that? Show me your data. If they don't have data on hand to start with, and every customer that walks in the door starts to ask for it and say, I don't feel comfortable buying your solution until I know that you've tested this and you can show me the data. I mean, that is one of the best pushes,
Yeah, for
to
sure.
create that fire under the tail.
Right. Yeah. Siri, I wanted to take a step back for a second because I feel like there's been a lot in the news and policies that coming down from the U.S. administration, even since we met in the city a month or two ago. Just in terms of the way that corporate America, as well as the collegiate system in the United States, is sort of reacting. So I feel like you're the perfect person to ask this because you've got your fingers and toes in all these different stakeholder communities. And so I was just wondering if we could just get your take on, how you feel this impacting, what you teach and what you talk to people about, whether you're talking about the book or just in general. Just curious to get your hot take.
Yeah, I don't know how hot it is, but I'll give you my take for sure. Look, it's obviously a moment of great uncertainty. The legal landscape might be shifting, but we don't know exactly how yet. And frankly, it's probably going to take months, if not years, for us to fully understand, okay, where does this go? What is changing? What's not? And how is it changing? So when there's that amount of uncertainty in the air, I think it's natural for people to do what they're doing right now, which is hunkering down and being very risk averse and feeling like this is not the moment to make big, bold moves, but this is maybe the moment to shore up the foundation and play it more safe. And I think that's the biggest thing that I'm seeing with corporations in the US. I mention specifically in the US because as I talk to organizations and leaders in other parts of the world, the responses are quite different. And I think that's just important to remember is sometimes for us sitting in the US, it feels like this is the whole world and it's so so all consuming what's happening here at home. But, the UK, the European Union are proceeding with very ambitious legislation, regulations, for example, around data disclosure, around things like pay gaps, and even quotas in the EU for women on corporate boards and things like that. So just because it looks like we might be seeing a bit of a retreat on the surface here in the US, one thing to remember is that's not universal. And then the other thing to remember is what things look like on the surface is not always reflective of what's actually happening underneath. And I would liken this to something very core to business's existence, like product development. If you're a tech company that ultimately sells any kind of product, right? You're not necessarily out there talking about your product development every day and saying, oh, well, our engineers are continuing to work on this latest new feature and we did some bug fixes yesterday and this and that. You're just doing it because that is your job. This is your company's reason for existence. And then when it's time to roll out that new product, when it's ready, okay, then you might do a big splashy event when you announced it. And then, of course, once it's out there in the market and selling as part of your quarterly and annual reports, you're going to report some financial results. And so when it comes to fairness or, what people might think of as diversity and equity and inclusion or DEI in the workplace, a lot of how that was manifesting in the last couple of years was a lot of the splashy events and talking and posting on social media. And now that that's gone away, people are looking at it and saying, wait, what's happening? Is anything happening anymore? Well, the truth is there's a lot of quiet, everyday actions happening behind the scenes, just like they always were. Companies trying to hire the best people, companies trying to evaluate people objectively, making sure that they advance the best talent into leadership roles, trying to provide, folks with equal amounts of support so that they can actually do their best work and bring their full potential to the benefit of the organization. And I do very much see that continuing in the background because it's just part of smart everyday business. And that's the hopeful part of the story that makes me very optimistic because I think this moment is an opportunity to check in and reevaluate what we've been doing before. Have all those splashy posts worked? Have all those events worked? In most cases, not. They haven't really translated into measurable results. But what does translate into measurable results is systems change, making small tweaks to how we work every day with things like hiring and project and work allocation and promotions. And I see more companies really moving in that direction, which is very encouraging.
Yeah, for sure. I was at an event last week it was all around, HR and talent, technology. And I've been in this space for a couple of years now. So I've been to several of these events over the last couple of years. And I would say this one last week, so this was the Transform conference, and it was my first time at Transform. I've been to some of the other bigger, actually some bigger and some smaller, but this one was the first one since I've been focused on like human-centric AI and responsible AI, where I wasn't the one initiating conversations on those subjects, right? In the past, it seemed like everyone was trying to draw attention to their latest shiny object, right? And it was, AI everywhere. And it goes back even before like generative AI came into the public, consciousness. And it just seemed like, hey, look at what we bolted on to our solution. Oh, we've got AI now too, and whatever. But no one, well, I shouldn't say no one, but it was common for people to not necessarily be able to explain the difference between automation and artificial intelligence, or the difference between the AI that existed, a decade ago that we might now classify as predictive AI, like an extension of analytics maturity to generative AI, or you know the maniacal focus on individual productivity instead of team effectiveness or organizational effectiveness. And so obviously these things take time to mature. That's why there's a Gartner hype cycle, and trough of disillusionment can sometimes take longer to get through than others, depending on what the technology is. But I was just excited to see that it wasn't me initiating conversations about fairness and human centricity and responsible AI. Like, these are actual themes of the conference, and there were themes that I saw in the online community that's been created for attendees and just people that are just part of this space, whatever role you're in HR and beyond. And so I was encouraged by what I saw. I'm not saying we're out of the woods by any stretch, but just given, part of it perhaps was actually a response, like a just collective response to what we're seeing going on in the United States, and just people saying, look, you can make whatever policies you want, but these are our principles, right? These are our values, and you're not going to change those. And this is how we're going to move forward, and this is how we're going to make progress. So I was quite encouraged by what I saw just last week.
Yeah, that's really encouraging to me to hear too. And I have heard this not just in the last couple of months, but frankly, across many years already, when I ask leaders of any type of organization, any sector, what's the most critical enabler of your business success? However they define it. Often they define it in terms of profit and financial results. But the most critical enabler tends to be the same, and that is our people. Because our people are the ones who are designing the products. They're out there selling them. They're deciding the strategy of which product to even try to design in the first place. And so if we don't have the right people in the right roles at the right time doing their best work, we just can't perform to our full potential as an organization. And that has been true, I would argue, basically always. And fairness is the foundation of that, because if we're not able to actually select the best talent, if we get distracted by, oh, who's the most similar to me, or who seems to have a fun personality versus who can actually do the job best, well, we're not going to be able to bring the best people in. And then if we can't evaluate talent objectively so that we advance the actual best people, or if we don't support people appropriately to allow them to thrive to their full potential, well, again, as a collective organization, we're not doing our best work. And so that's why I'm so hopeful to hear what you said in your experience about the conference, but also just hopeful about this moment and that it can be kind of us doubling down on looking at what are all the ways in which we're actually creating the highest performing organizations and leveraging fairness to do that to an even greater degree than we have before.
Yeah, I love it. I think that ties in so well to a lot of the sort of tenets of this human-centric AI council that I recently joined around, how do we use AI in a way that gets the best out of us human beings, right? Now that could be individually, or it could be, as I alluded to before, the team effectiveness, but how do you really get the organization to look at the relationship between human beings and technology such that we progress together, so that AI is designed to get the best out of us through, there's individual levers like you alluded to before, like, personalized, instead of personalized, medicine, maybe it's, personalized learning, customized sort of growth path to leverage all of your, innate, human talents and skills and creativity and things of that nature, and let AI, do what it does best. We know that can be sort of a gray area these days because everyone's trying to just push AI to the limits and see what else could we take off a human being's plate, as it were. But we still got to recognize that, the future of work is humans plus AI. It's not how quickly AI can just, take over, everything that humans are doing. But I think it also, part of what's underlying, I think what you described is having the cognitive diversity within some of these teams, especially teams sort of overseeing some of these the AI adoption across the organization. But do you have the cognitive diversity to recognize all of these different sort of use cases, just like you'd want the appropriate specialists back in the lab, looking at all these different, perhaps one-off, scenarios where, maybe a particular, therapy or, medicine isn't appropriate for a particular demographic. And so how do you elevate that such that you catch it, as early as possible? So I think that's part of, when I think of diversity more broadly, this is not just what you see, physically on the surface, someone's, skin color, gender, et cetera. It's how do they think, and can we incorporate all of those differences into our decision making so we make the most sort of data informed decision.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the other super important thing that you just highlighted is that the arrival or emergence of AI is prompting a lot of important and frankly overdue conversations about the skills and the talents and requirements for different roles and how that translates into pay, how that translates into prestige, what's considered essential versus not. So I'll give you one concrete example. We know that there's a gender pay gap overall across the economy, where in the United States, women make about 83% as much as men. So men make about 17 cents more on the dollar, or women make 83 cents on the dollar. But even in specific jobs where the nature of the job is very similar, such as between a manager in the IT function of a company versus a manager in the HR function of a company, we see pay gaps, where HR managers on average are paid less than IT managers, even though, again, the nature of the job is actually incredibly similar. Now, what's different is most IT managers tend to be men and most HR managers tend to be women. And so that's just one way in which the systematic devaluation in society of women's work manifests itself. But one of the ways to fix this, and actually this philosophy has been pioneered by New Zealand, for example, the International Labour Organization on on an international scale, where we break down jobs into their component skills and actually say, okay, what is it that a manager in an IT or HR function is concretely doing and needs to be able to do? And then we rebuild the compensation scale in an organization by valuing individual skills and looking at, okay, we've got these two jobs that look very different and in the past were paid very differently, but actually the people in those two jobs need to be doing exactly the same things and have the exact same skills. Well, that's a pretty strong argument to pay those jobs the same. And so where this comes back to AI is, as you were saying, the advent of AI is kind of forcing us to anyway reconsider who should do what. What does it make sense to outsource to the machine versus where do humans continue to add unique value? And what exactly is that value and how much should we pay for it? These are super, super important and foundational questions. I think we're just starting to ask them. But again, from a fairness lens, if we do this right, if we do this process in a thorough and smart way, I think we have the potential to come out on the other side with a much fairer way of valuing all humans' work of all kinds.
I'm really glad you brought this up because I have been looking at these concepts around like work redesign, what work should stay on a human being's plate, what should go to AI. And I've been looking at it through a certain lens that says I don't want I want people to control their own destiny, right? And I want people to recognize where AI is going to come in and impact their work, how quickly that may happen, not just for their role and the way that role is scoped, but that role at that organization, et cetera. And it was really so that people don't get caught sort of flat-footed and have to make a pivot under that pressure as opposed to being proactive about it and maybe reskilling or learning how to use AI more effectively and things like that. What I was not necessarily doing was looking at it through this lens of this is an opportunity as we do this work redesign to almost start with a blank sheet of paper and say, look, not only are we going to take these roles completely apart, break them down into a task level and say, okay, these are the things that maybe AI or automation should do. These are the things that we're going to keep on a human being's plate. But now let's not just rewrite the job description. Let's think about who who that affects across everything, across like career trajectory, potential, and then compensation. Doesn't matter who's in this. We're removing people from this exercise completely, right? We're talking about the work itself. And then once you've done that, you say, well, because then it would become more obvious to say, oh, we're going to put, you know, Sally in this, job instead of Joe. And therefore the pay is the pay. And now we're going to just put a capable human being with potential to succeed in that role. We're going to put them there, and nothing else really matters, right? Are they capable of being successful in this role? Are they capable of leading this team? Are they capable of aligning, talent strategy with technical strategy with business strategy and move the organization forward? And nothing else really matters.
Yeah. And the other place where this comes up a lot is flexible work. A lot of organizations have tried to institute sort of a one size fits all flexibility policy on the surface to be quote unquote fair in the sense that we treat everyone exactly the same and one person doesn't get upset because another person gets to work from home 2 days a week. But one thing that conversation misses is most modern day organizations have people in roles that require entirely different actions. Right? So if you are, I'm thinking of, at the Kennedy School, Harvard Kennedy School, where I work, we have janitorial staff and staff who do a heroic job of feeding us in the cafeteria. Well, that's a job that can't be done remotely because you have to be there physically cleaning, you have to be there physically serving and preparing the food. Then we have a lot of colleagues whose job is administration and budgetary oversight and approving expenses. And that job is 100% on the computer, right? So yes, these people work in the same organization, but they're doing totally different things on a daily basis. And so it just speaks to this opportunity, really, that this moment presents, and this is why I'm so excited about the future of work personally, is to get much more granular about how we structure work for different types of roles, for different types of requirements, because that can vary even within one organization. Even within a division, you might have teams next to each other that are doing super, super different work. And having more flexibility in how people structure it could make people not only a lot more productive, as a lot of the research on remote work suggests, is when you allow people to self-select in the types of work arrangements that they prefer, that's when we truly maximize productivity because humans are different. Surprise, surprise. So to not only maximize productivity, but also maximize retention, maximize people's engagement in the job and satisfaction in the job. So there's just so much exciting, untapped opportunity and potential here, but it requires us to approach work and structuring roles quite differently from what we've done in the past.
Yeah, agree. Sarah, I wanted to ask you about AI literacy in general. I think about this in the education sector, even before higher education. I mean, I think about I got a computer when I was, I don't know, probably 12 years old. You know, my daughter's been using digital devices since she was a toddler and getting ready to apply to college now. And so I think about her readiness. I'm sure she'll use AI in college and certainly afterwards. I think about her job prospects as well. But even folks who are already in the workforce, it seems like there's still a lot of apprehension for whatever reason for organizations to provide the necessary you know training. So I was just curious to get your thoughts on the scope and breadth of AI literacy, of course, incorporating some of these sort of responsible AI kind of concepts. How do you see
I
things
think this
shaping?
is an absolutely critical piece of the puzzle, both within organizations, but as we zoom out and think about the bigger picture across organizations and across industries, right? I think what would be the worst outcome is if we wound up with this multi-tiered system where AI becomes increasingly important and people who are already working in the most well-remunerated jobs, kind of knowledge worker, white-collar type occupations, where companies might be investing in AI training and helping to upskill their workforce continuously, those people to continue to kind of succeed and thrive even more. And then folks who happen to be in occupations where AI is not used as much yet are getting zero training and are kind of left even further behind as AI permeates more and more of what we do in work, but also just in life in general. So I think it's really important to think within organizations, but also across the all of society, of how do we make sure that as much as possible, no one gets left behind? And what is the way in we upskill people on the use of AI? What is the way in which we give them exposure to it so that they can practice and learn? To your point, kids do this naturally. You give them any gadget, they just start punching buttons and going. Adults don't do that. And the majority of the population is still adults today. So how do we make sure that across the socioeconomic spectrum, across the types of work that we're engaged in, no, everyone gets to jump on this train. Everyone is pulled onto this train and giving the upskilling and reskilling. I'll tell you, I personally feel very unprepared. I've sat in on a few sessions that fellow faculty have done about kind of the AI is coming, you got to pay attention. But I find it very hard as just a non-technologically savvy average person individual to even find where would I go looking for this information and how to create good prompts. And if you ask ChatGPT for something and you're not happy with the result, what do you tweak to get a better result next time? And that education is just not out there to a sufficient degree at all yet.
Yeah, that's been my observation, and obviously I have my own thoughts and ideas of how to fix that. But you're right. I mean, this is something that I think everyone should have access to. I don't want to.
Hi, I'm Carmen Hudson. I'm the host of the Recruiting Book Club, and we're starting our second season. I'm so excited to bring to you another set of guests of recruiters who have written books. We are excited to have some very special guests this season. We've got Shally, we've got Craig Fisher, James Ellis, and quite a few other people that we're going to bring on board to tell us about what they wrote, why they wrote it, and maybe we'll veer off into a conversation about recruiting on all types of topics and subjects that happen in our industry. So I hope you can join us. I'm excited.
Exacerbate, the current situation with, haves and have-nots. And, I think there's definitely some institutions that are trying to make headway in that area, right? I know, Google's done some stuff with higher ed, and I think Microsoft, offers some free training and things like that. I just don't know, organizations themselves need to embrace that and say, we're going to take people on this journey. We're going to communicate clearly. These are our expectations. I do think clearest communication you can make is around, ethics and responsibility and trust. Some of these foundational principles within responsible AI. I think those things can be taught at least down to the high school level, if not earlier. I mean, kids know if they're doing something wrong that might be considered, cheating or inappropriate, not safe for school, just like we have not safe for work. So they're they're smarter than some people give them credit for, and they're also very curious, right? So they're already playing with some of these tools, and I think they just need to have some guidance and known. To your point before, like you've got to know whether you trust, the output of these solutions and how to increase your confidence that it's actually giving you appropriate answers. So I think, some of that is coming slowly but surely. But I just think talk about leveling the playing field with, you don't have to have a technical background to take advantage of some of these tools and, start to build, businesses at least through a, side hustle if you don't want to put all your eggs in that basket. But I just think there's some of these core principles beyond even just, how to prompt better. Just some of these overall knowledge sort of modules could be around like what's an agent and what can an agent do for me versus an assistant versus, all these things. I mean, AI comes in a variety of forms, but I think especially for younger generation, I mean, you've got to understand how this may impact your job prospects. I mean, my daughter doesn't know what she's going to study in college yet, but to me, already that could be influencing, where she might want to go to school. Who's got programs that are embracing, modern, technology, or are they sticking to like a core, liberal arts curriculum, for example? So I think more and more, this is going to start to, work its way sort of down to younger generations and earlier, educational institutions at middle school, high school level, primary school for those not in the U.S.
Which I think it will have to, right? Because if AI becomes as big a part of society as many people now believe that it will ultimately become, then in order to be a human in this world, it's going to be a basic life skill to know how to, I guess, engage, for lack of a better word, with AI. It's going to be as critical as saying 1+1 = 2 and knowing how to speak a language. So that has to make us re-examine education starting from kindergarten. Even things like that analogy to driving of you don't have to be a car mechanic. You don't know how to build a car in order to drive it. But at the same time, before we allow you to drive on our roads, you have to pass a basic competency test, which is why we
Yeah,
have driver's licenses in all countries of the world.
exactly.
So if AI becomes that ubiquitous, and we already know it's very powerful, maybe we have to consider something similar, not just for managers and people in the workplace, to incorporate kind of engaging with AI as a core competency that they're expected to have, but just as humans, that engaging with AI has to be some core competence that we help people with, but also make sure that they reach a minimum level before they're allowed to be out there in the world using these tools.
Yeah. And I think the other aspect of that is, you know, anyone can build these tools now, right? So it's not just pushing the responsibility to these solution providers who are building these, sort of industrial strength, solutions for the masses. Anyone can fit, any of these high school kids we're alluding to, or even middle school kid, you know, almost as easily as they could probably build something in like Minecraft or Roblox or one of these other platforms, they could be building with AI, right? So you're going to build something that's sort of constructive and ethical and doesn't infringe on others, privacy or civil rights or things like that. I mean, it just seems like, you know, these kids are these kids are ready, and why not proactively, get them ready for the jobs of the future? I agree with you. I mean, AI is becoming ubiquitous, even if it's not, labeled as such going forward. I remember when I was at IBM, we came out with all these like, marketing programs around smarter this, smarter that, right? Smarter plant, all under this smarter planet umbrella. And now looking at everything that we can do with AI and looking back at some of that messaging, it's just like, well, if you thought that was smart, you haven't seen anything yet, right?
Right.
So yeah, I think, but it's all sort of part of the same, trajectory in some ways. And I just think, people are, I think a lot of people are ready, and they don't necessarily realize it because, as you alluded to before, sometimes they just aren't sure where to start. All it is just constant flooding of the airwaves, right? We saw through this last, professional sports, season. You've got AI, Google Gemini and Apple Intelligence and all these commercials, and people are just still trying to absorb it all and how it, what it means for them. So, is there anything you've been playing with in terms of generative AI?
Oh, I'm so, a neophyte when it comes to all of this. I've used ChatGPT a couple of times. I will tell you one thing that it's been very helpful with is I've never felt like I'm very creative at coming up with titles for papers or, lectures or sessions or courses or things like this. And then often whenever you have to generate a title, you also have to generate that sort of 2 or 3 sentence summary description for a course or workshop that you're doing. And I found ChatGPT to be very helpful with that. Sometimes I use what it spits out as is. Sometimes it gives me a piece of inspiration or an idea that I then tweak from. I'm one of those scaredy cats who is still so concerned about the hallucinations that I haven't trusted it to give me outputs where I can't verify whether the output is correct or not. So basically asking it questions to which I don't know the answer and then
Yeah,
trusting that the answers it gives are
yeah,
actually real. Maybe I'm too risk averse. Maybe I'm too scared. And that might be part of the problem for some of us in adopting this technology is if we don't trust it fully, if we don't feel like we understand it fully, then we do nothing instead of trying a little bit.
no, for sure. Yeah, no, I do think I use it the same way, like for podcast title. episodes. Like I want to give me something, but I don't want it to like reuse, some of the words that I used in the last couple episodes. But no, it's definitely good as a thought partner in that way. But you also raise an interesting point that we'll have to save for another conversation. But this part around, can I trust the output, and whether or not you have the domain knowledge enough to know whether I can trust the solution. So that is one caution for some of the younger generation using some of these tools. They may just be trying to use it to help with a research paper or something like that, and like they're researching it in part because they actually don't know the subject. They're learning it as they go, and so
Exactly.
that could be a little bit tricky. I've certainly been in situations where I did know the subject matter, and I knew enough to just basically call it out. Just like, I don't think that's accurate. Can you check that again or whatever? And then it somehow miraculously comes back, oh my God, you were right. And I don't know what changed in the 30 seconds between those responses. But anyway, yeah, no, trust is a huge factor. So that's, again, part of the AI literacy that we need to instill.
100%.
So, yeah. Well, Siri, this has been an awesome conversation, really insightful. Thank you so much for joining me. And I think there's a lot for my listeners to take away from this. I encourage everyone to pick up a copy of your new book, Make Work Fair. I will put a link to that in the show notes.
Thank you, Bob. It's been such a pleasure joining you. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Excellent. All right. Thanks again, Siri. And thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.